Back to the Future is without question one of the greatest movies ever made, and is also without question one of my all-time favorite movies. Like most, I've seen it countless times and can quote it verbatim. It combines the genres of action, adventure, comedy, drama, fantasy, romance, and science fiction so efficiently. It's a film I never grow tired of watching, and as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate the film in certain ways I didn't quite understand as a kid. With this video, I'm going to simply discuss why I truly love a film many have described, myself included, as a perfect movie. Let's get into why I love Back to the Future. Let's start by talking about the plot. We all know the basic plot of Back to the Future. A teenager named Marty McFly is best friends with eccentric scientist Emmett Brown, whose newest invention, a time machine made out of a DeLorean, accidentally sets him back to 1955, where he interferes with his parents' first meeting and must scramble to get them together, while also trying to find a way to return back to his own time. While the narrative becomes a race against time once Marty arrives in 1955, what's truly remarkable is the amount of information delivered before he even travels back. The first 20 minutes are littered with small details that make the rest of the movie so much more meaningful. We know immediately that time is going to be essential. Before the title of the film is even revealed, the first sounds we hear are of clocks. We're shown numerous clocks, including one referencing the 1923 film Safety First, and a foreshadowing of what's to come. On the wall is a newspaper article stating that Doc's fortune is gone and he's now bankrupt. This shows he was once wealthy and possibly even respected, but has put everything he owns into realizing his dream of traveling through time. On the bed is the VCR camera that Marty has to pick up later. And on the TV, we hear about the new model Toyota that's the object of Marty's desire, as well as plutonium gone missing, which is what Doc's using to power the time machine. We then get introduced to Marty McFly, and we find out just about everything we need to know about him in a few minutes. He skateboards, has a girlfriend, plays the guitar, and is routinely late for school. We're only 5 minutes in, and already it's a race against time. I like how, while he's a combination of snarky and quirky, Marty McFly is also a bit insecure. When his audition doesn't go the way he thought it would, he begins to sound like his old man by saying,
"What if I send in the tape and they don't like it? I mean, what if they say I'm no good?
What if they didn't like them? What if they told me I was no good?"
And let's not forget that that audition was to play in front of the entire school, but I'll get back to this point later on. His home life is not what you'd call rock and roll. Marty feels like the one person who doesn't fit into his family's depression, and you can tell he's someone who wishes life to be better. He sees the flaws of his family just as we do, and it's conveyed both visually and through carefully placed exposition. Now let's get into the pacing. Because the film heavily relies on the value of time, there never feels like there's a dull moment in Back to the Future. Marty has to go to the mall at 1:15 a.m. When he gets to 1955, he tries to locate Doc, but gets sidetracked by meeting both his parents and screwing up how they met. When he finally does find Doc, he finds out his only hope to return to the present is for the time machine to get struck by lightning 1 week after he arrives. But because he messed up his parents' meeting, which stated by Lorraine,
"If Grandpa hadn't hit him, then none of you would have been born."
he now has to scramble to figure out a new way to get them together. And even when he finally returns to 1985, he scrambles to get to Doc when the DeLorean stalls again. Every sequence is laid out so perfectly from the first act. All the problems of the present are carefully placed to make the events that take place in 1955 more impactful. It should also be noted that Marty doesn't travel back in time until the 31-minute mark, and his first interaction with his father is at the 40-minute mark. Once he meets Doc, which is basically the midpoint of the film, we learn about the lightning strike on November 12th, and now we have the point of no return. This also means that Marty has a week to properly converse with his parents to somehow get them together. The movie is able to be both intimate and fast-paced because we know time is of the essence, but the character interactions are just as necessary because Marty has the time to know his parents as teens themselves. Now let's get into the cast. Without great characters, the plot of any movie can become meaningless. But even with great characters, if they aren't played by convincing actors, then those characters can just be flat out unlikable or unengaging. Fortunately for Back to the Future, this is one of the most perfectly cast movies I've ever seen. All the characters strike a chord because they're portrayed by such talented actors. Michael J. Fox was known for Family Ties, and this was his feature film debut, but it truly showed what a talented actor he really is. He brings so much to this performance, especially with his physicality. Let's look at him basically stumbling into 1955. This doesn't require a hint of dialogue. In addition, there's his chemistry with the one and only Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown. We get the perfect sense that their friendship literally transcends time and space. They would do anything for each other. Then there's Crispin Glover, who plays the nervous, slouched, unconfident George McFly. The whole idea of Back to the Future was conceived with writer Bob Gale imagining if he would have been friends with his father or even liked his father in high school. It's an idea I'm sure many people have had, and Back to the Future was really that first movie that tried to show what it would be like. Marty McFly interacts with every single character involved in the film, and fortunately his chemistry with his on-screen father is fantastic. He practically acts like a father figure to his own father, and instills the most important life lesson he can provide.
There's nothing to be scared of. All it takes is a little self-confidence. You know, if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
Then there's Leah Thompson as Lorraine. She was fresh off the exploitative Jaws 3, as well as the Cold War actioner Red Dawn, to take the role of a teenager who falls in love with her son. Now obviously she has no idea that this is her son, but just the idea of a mother falling in love with her soon-to-be son is just creepy. In the film, she has to display the sweetness of Lorraine while also displaying the creep factor of the situation. Lorraine comes from a very conservative family, but has a fiery, liberal spirit to her that really makes the character both seductive and sentimental. And of course, we have Thomas F. Wilson as the one and only Biff Tannen.
What are you looking at, butthead?
From all accounts, I've heard he's a very nice person, which means he played the role of an asshole perfectly. There's James Tolkien as the no-nonsense Strickland, Claudia Wells as Marty's girlfriend Jennifer, Donald Fullilove as future mayor Goldie Wilson, Harry Waters Jr. as Marvin Berry, the cousin of Chuck Berry. Everyone is so perfectly cast in their roles. Alongside the cast, the plot, and the pacing comes the director himself, Robert Zemeckis. His direction serves as a shining example of why the film works as well as it does. Bob Gale's beautiful script is translated with the same intensity, but also displaying the heart of the characters. There's not a single scene in Back to the Future that feels out of place. It all flows so wonderfully through Zemeckis' use of visual language. There's always something to look at in this movie, and I believe the average median shot length has got to be at least 15 seconds. It's quite old-fashioned with the use of long takes where he just lets his actors act. Movies don't really do this anymore. This leads to some of my favorite little moments, like when Biff and his gang start trying to mess with Marty, George tries to join in to laugh at him. Or when Doc tells Marty to turn off the camera when discussing how he got the plutonium, Marty is still recording him the entire time. When Marty mentions the possibility of George and Lorraine having kids in the future, the looks on their faces are just so precious and innocent. Zemeckis really takes his time in letting us feel for the characters and how they change through the progression of the story. And speaking of storytelling techniques, one of the best strengths of director Robert Zemeckis is the use of the environments and the actors in both the foreground and the background. The greatest comedies of all time always have you coming back for more, and Back to the Future is no exception. There's always something happening in virtually every shot to get the viewer more entranced in the world. Let's go back to Marty stumbling his way to the clock tower in 1955. Notice that Biff's car is parked there the whole time. I love this detail because that means Biff and his gang were just randomly walking around and just so happened to spot George inside Lou's Cafe. And speaking of Lou's Cafe, later on in the film, Marty has to literally push his father to talk to his mother. George walks over to the table and asks Lou to give him a chocolate milkshake. I love the off-screen sliding of the glass, but I never until recently paid attention to Marty standing in the background. Now I can't unsee it. Now let's talk about Alan Silvestri. Many of the best films of all time feature a score that feels like it transcends time and space. They move us and take us to places we never thought we could go. Alan Silvestri's score for Back to the Future is without a doubt one of the most beautiful soundtracks of all time. I mean, what other movie has this sound? Silvestri is able to capture the heart of the dramatic and romantic sequences while also making our hearts pound with his action cues for the introduction of the Libyans, to the skateboard chase, to the clock tower. All these elements add up to a score that 35 years later is just as impactful as it was when it came out. Now let's address the DeLorean.
If you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?
This is a rather self-exclamatory point, but we are talking about why I love this movie so much. And not mentioning the fact that the DeLorean is one of the coolest looking cars ever made would simply be a mistake. Everything about it, from the doors opening, to the immaculate interior with the flux capacitor and time circuits, to the screeching of the tires, it's all just so iconic. Not to mention, this movie was also responsible for saving John DeLorean's career, and he thanked both Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis for, quote, immortalizing my car. The first time traveler. One of my favorite parts about Einstein's trip is that no music plays throughout the scene. We as the audience have no idea, and neither does Doc, that his invention will work. There's also this theory that's circled around that I actually subscribe to if you watch the film very carefully, that Doc was planning to kill himself if his experiment didn't work. Again, think about it. He spent his entire fortune on this invention, and his life is now in danger by a terrorist organization that he screwed over. Again, I love how this sequence is devoid of music. We're in true awe with Marty and Doc without a single musical cue to determine our emotion. Of course, once the DeLorean leaves its infamous fire trail behind, Alan Silvestri comes in to boost our excitement.
88 miles per hour!
The Eric Stoltz moment. Remember when the Libyan's gun gets jammed and Marty then darts for the DeLorean? The shot of him diving into the car was not Michael J. Fox's stunt double, but rather the original actor who played him, Eric Stoltz. The shot is so quick, you have to really slow it down to see his face. The butterfly effect. While Back to the Future certainly isn't the first film to deal with time travel, it presented not just the beauty, but the danger of going to the past and interfering with historical events. The stakes throughout the film are so high because all Marty has to do is, screw up his own parents from meeting. Because of what we learned from his mother at the beginning of the film, that was the start of their relationship. Marty's own life is now in danger because them meeting that way was how he eventually will be born. This also means any action Marty does, every step he makes, if he creates a dent in the sidewalk, that could change the course of history. My next point, the special effects. In a time before CGI, special effects in movies were always pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And in the case of Back to the Future, that was definitely on the mind of Robert Zemeckis. The 1980s is by far my favorite decade for movies, and one of their biggest charms is that even though some of their effects haven't particularly aged well, they have this truly timeless feel about them due to the practicality on display, which adds to the realism of the moment. In the case of Back to the Future, the picture of Marty and his siblings is an effect that has really held up well. And speaking of the 80s, I absolutely love the visuals and the sound of thunder and lightning. It's just so cool, and I love that sound. The skateboard. This sequence became a staple of the Back to the Future trilogy. Despite Doc's warning that Marty's actions could disrupt the space-time continuum because he could interfere with historical events, there isn't one specific person credited with inventing skateboarding. It's a bit weird seeing Biff's obvious driving double though, but it's such a fun action sequence, and plus the ending is another truly iconic moment. Now let's get into the punch. Violence in movies can quite often be a tricky subject to defend. There's the phrase, fighting never solves anything, but for the case of Back to the Future, this is one of those times where we have to go against that saying. We all know up until this point that Biff is a complete asshole and a bully, but he has now become a rapist, holding Lorraine against her will with the intent to physically assault her. George sees the action from a distance, and from Marty's description beforehand, it looks exactly as he described. Biff has pushed George around for years, but it's through George's knowledge that a girl is in trouble that he decides to stand his ground. His first punch to Biff is weak, simply illustrating his fear for standing up to a bully. It's through Biff's actions towards Lorraine that caused George to muster up all his strength to knock him out. I'm sure when this was released 35 years ago, everybody in the cinema cheered. And after all these years, this moment has not lost an ounce of its adrenaline. It's crazy to think that a punch can really change not just a character, but the film itself, and yet Back to the Future does both of these perfectly. When George picks up Lorraine, this is not the George Lorraine took pity on at the beginning of the film. This is a man who will stand up for himself. The fact that an act of violence changes three characters simultaneously is a major accomplishment on writers Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis. Now let's get into the dance, where we're going to talk about one specific word throughout this sequence: confidence. Through George's actions, he single-handedly took out his bully. But one of my favorite things going into the next scene is that this action doesn't completely change him. While on the dance floor, some random guy comes and takes Lorraine away from George, and he hesitates at first. He proved he wasn't afraid of his main bully, but now he has to prove that nobody will push him around ever again. And his line delivery to the kid is not that of a shy loner, but rather a confident man.
Excuse me.
And when he takes Lorraine into his arms to kiss her, the bond created is a knot that cannot be untied. The song ends with a loving embrace that fixes the space-time continuum and saves Marty's life. Speaking of the dance, there's also Johnny Be Good. Calling this part of the movie unnecessary, I just don't understand why anyone could complain about this. Marty has successfully gotten his parents together, and their kiss leads to his eventual conception, and his life is saved. But also think about this. Marty was auditioning to play in front of the whole school at the beginning of the film, and was told by his own principal he doesn't have a chance. Well, this is now his chance to deliver what he's got. And in doing so, his performance single-handedly inspires Chuck Berry, AC/DC, Jimi Hendrix, and Van Halen all at the same time. It feels like its own climactic scene, and all the themes and obstacles the characters have now overcome.
Guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
The clock tower sequence. The climax of a film is always supposed to be the scene that engages us the most. We've been on this emotional roller coaster with these amazing characters and life lessons being applied along the way. The whole movie has truly led to this moment. The cuts come in quick, a contrast to the long continuous takes we're used to, but they're just long enough to let our eyes soak in every anxiety-induced moment of it. It's also intense because Marty can't just sit there in the car and let the lightning strike. He has to hit the wire at the exact moment the lightning strikes the flux capacitor, and traveling 88 miles per hour for the time circuits to function. If he was 1 second early or 1 second late, he would never have gone home. You know it's a great film when you still get the same goosebumps no matter how many times you watch the scene. I promise you, no matter how many times I see this movie, every time I watch this sequence, I always wonder if he's gonna make it. This leads to Doc's celebration. There's a reason this moment is shown in all 3 movies of the trilogy. Imagine you're an inventor that's routinely looked down on for being eccentric, who creates a device to travel through time. Due to his interaction with Marty, Doc is fully aware that he'll succeed in his dream 30 years later, but now he's seeing his invention work firsthand 30 years prior. Like him, we all want to scream in the air because everything the film's built up on has now paid off. And Doc is seeing the future of his scientific exploits. It's a truly beautiful moment, especially when Doc stops and looks up to the clock that is now changed forever. I also believe Doc was thinking, you know what? Maybe I will read that letter. And again, I love how after Marty returns, he's still in a race against time to save Doc from the Libyans. I truly hate when movies just run out of gas after the climax. And yes, that pun was definitely intended. And finally, the beauty of time travel. There are so many things to take away from Back to the Future. And as I've gotten older, I see it as much more than just a fun time travel adventure. With adventure movies in general, you have to ask yourself, what is it that makes them stand as some of the all-time greats? In short, it's because the story inside the adventure usually has much more meaning than the adventure itself. Back to the Future is an adventure story that will always be a fulfilling one because, while it's simply an entertaining film, Marty's journey makes his family life better. Sure, he interfered with his parents' meeting and his mother fell in love with him, but through his insistence they should be together, he was able to give his father the confidence he needed to stand up for himself, and his mother falling in love with George not out of pity, but through genuine emotion, and also being protected from being raped. Back to the Future exhibits the beauty of time travel because through this adventure, our main character had the opportunity to alter events to make life better, but not through arrogance. Back to the Future is a movie I have seen countless times and will continue to for the rest of my life. This was definitely the movie that made me fall in love with time travel. But like the greatest classics I watched at a young age, I appreciate it on such a different level now that I'm older. And while there are people who can nitpick the ending and try to call it a massive plot hole, that doesn't change the fact that the story, the themes, and the characters all work together in harmony through Bob Gale's screenplay under the spectacular direction of Robert Zemeckis. Back to the Future is a perfect movie because of its honesty and sincerity, and should never be remade because there's absolutely nothing to improve. It is, and always will be, one of the best movies of all time.